Paul Vanderklay is a minister and Calvinist YouTuber. Today, he's going to come on to talk about Calvinism. So what led you to Christianity?
Well, that's a good question. My father was a Christian. My mother was a Christian. I was born into a Christian household. It was, for me, sort of the default position growing up. And then the question would be, why didn't anything lead you away from Christianity? And I think the answer to that was, I've never found anything better.
Do you believe Christianity accurately describes reality?
Generally, yes. Accurately is an interesting word. Faithfully might be a better word. Accurate sort of brings in a lot of other assumptions about how we know reality. I think our grasp on reality is pretty tenuous, and I think Christianity tells us the truth. Say it that way.
What's the difference between accuracy and truth?
It might be accurate to say my neighbor is a jerk or my neighbor is a wonderful person, and there would be truth in both claims. But there's a lot more truth than just that my neighbor is a jerk or a wonderful person.
What led you to Calvinism, and why do you believe it?
Well, sort of like Christianity, I was born into it, and I haven't really found anything better to leave it for. Calvinism, John Calvin was a second-generation Protestant reformer, and what he really tried to do is bring some order to the Protestant Reformation. He changed more, or he agreed with, get into the weeds of the Reformation pretty easily. After Luther sort of broke from the Roman Catholic Church, there's a lot of question in terms of, well, what now? John Calvin was a French refugee because it became increasingly difficult to live and worship in France as someone who was not Roman Catholic. And so he, like many other French refugees, went to Geneva, and he studied with a lot of other people who were basically trying to get at what they thought was a truer Christianity beneath a lot of what they believed was added to the faith unnecessarily. Now, there's a lot that goes on in the Protestant Reformation, and I think now that some 500 years have passed, we have a little better understanding of why they made some of the decisions they made. I have a new friend who is a Roman Catholic theologian who made this really wonderful book, Transubstantiation, which goes into Luther misreading Aquinas and Calvin, I think, getting a better handle on the Lord's Supper as real presence. There's just a lot of work in that, in European humanism at the time, trying to get a sense of, okay, what's really going on. And Calvinism has, a lot of people define Calvinism quite narrowly, particularly around the as sometimes known, either tulip or the 5 points of grace, sometimes people will call them. And I'm not trying to back away from those, but that's by no means all that Calvinism became. Calvinism sort of became a broad, sort of generic Protestantism, out of which most other Protestant movements grew, with the exception of the Radical Reformation, which was the Anabaptist. So Calvinism, I think, attempts to gives us, I think, the latitude to be a Christian in the modern world. And there is a lot that goes into that. But I grew up in the Christian Reformed Church. I'm an ordained minister in the Christian Reformed Church. I don't plan on leaving it. And again, that doesn't mean I think the Christian Reformed Church gets everything right. I just don't see a reason to leave it for something else.
So in that case, do you believe there's truth in other religions, or that you happen to be born into the correct one?
Well, there's a big difference between there's truth in other religions and there's truth in all religions. part of that difficulty is how do religions hold truth? Certainly, people of other religions know a great deal of truth. Other religions can sometimes illuminate certain aspects of life and certain capacities within this world. Christianity tends to be an exclusivistic religion because the claims of Jesus Christ are quite alarming. And so a lot of the phrases like "there are truth in other religions" sort of try to get one in a corner with respect to certain contemporary hangups that we have. Whereas people of many faiths know how to love their children, know how to do science, know how to do math. Many different religious traditions illuminate things about this world and enable people to do good things in this world. That isn't a knock on those religions at all. But I wonder, I don't think these other religions show us a lot of what we need to see. For example, I was preaching this week on the centurion found in Luke chapter 7. And it's a remarkable story because here is a slave-owning oppressor who is doing his job to keep the corrupting Roman imperial system and culture leaning onto God's people and their promised land. And by virtue of his interaction with Jesus, Jesus claims that he hasn't found such great faith even amongst God's chosen people in the Galilee, in Capernaum. That's a pretty amazing thing. Now, do we want to make comments about truth in the Roman way? Life is really complicated in this way. And so that's part of how, if I look at the world, let's say through the story of Jesus and the centurion, we can say amazing things about people and amazing things about people's interactions with Jesus that surprised even Jesus. So I want to keep that kind of openness in my world without having to undermine some of the things Jesus didn't want to undermine, let's say Moses, the law, and the prophets.
What do you think about the rise of atheism?
I was just recently watching a series of videos on atheism. What we mean by atheism, at least what's often meant on YouTube by atheism, is sort of a little word game about the existence of God. And what's interesting is, not unlike the situation with Martin Luther and his assumptions about the Lord's presence in Holy Communion, when someone says they do or don't believe in God, I'll usually stop them to try and get a sense of what they mean by God. And in most cases, I find many people sort of have a picture, usually inspired by something like Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, and that for them is God. God is a super being who somehow lives invisibly or mysteriously or in another dimension that is sort of incidental to the ongoing business of the planet, and maybe can be called upon to do special favors for us. Recently, a sociologist named Christian Smith called some of this moralistic therapeutic deism, where that entire conception of what we mean by the word God is built on an assumption that the world can sort of stand on its own. I tend to prefer to point to an idea that Dorothy Sayers, an English mystery writer, pointed out. She was a friend of C.S. Lewis and a bunch of these people in the middle of the 20th century. When she noted the relationship between us and God is in some ways analogous to the relationship between a character in a novel and the author of the novel. And I liken this, for example, to if Frodo had to look for Tolkien in Middle-earth, where could he find him? And in that sense, it would be very difficult for Frodo to locate Tolkien, even though Tolkien is all around him. And so this current crop of atheists sort of smuggles in or is smuggled in by a whole group of other assumptions about the nature of reality that I don't necessarily agree with. And so if what they mean by God is something akin to Thor or Zeus, yeah, there's some issues there, but even those issues go pretty deep, because if you ask the question, what did ancient people think a god was, their categories of imagination are quite a bit different from ours. I tend to think that a lot of contemporary atheism is really very late stage Protestantism, where a sort of deism has taken hold and the earth runs on its own, leaving sort of a naturalism that, if you take to its logical conclusions, kind of lands where Sam Harris lands. There's no such thing as free will. There's no such thing as human agency. And we're all just playing a game. And whenever Sam Harris is confronted on this, saying, doesn't that sort of take the stuffing out of life? He says, no, watching a movie is great. And I think that's a terribly unsatisfying answer.
What are your thoughts on LGBTQ plus people?
Well, it's interesting to ask a question, LGBTQ plus people, because I'm not sure why you would lump a man who considers himself a man who is sexually attracted to other men with, let's say, a second grader who has a penis and wants to be a girl. It's a little bit difficult to imagine exactly what category these two people share. So I don't know if you want to tighten your question a little bit.
In that case, you could say, what should the church do about sexual and gender minorities?
Well, churches all over are having fights over how a church should regard, let's say, a same-sex couple. And by regard, it means, does basically the default Christian position with respect to a sexual ideal, which is that sexuality is best acted upon in the context of a monogamous relationship between a man and a woman. That being an ideal, the question is, what should Christians do with people whose sexual behavior lands outside that ideal? That's long been a question Christianity and pretty much every community has struggled with. What's interesting to me about the question is that I think a lot of what we're dealing with in our society right now is not so much a difficulty about particular ideals. It's how we imagine, what we imagine an ideal to be. Let's say divorce was a big fight in a lot of churches for a long time and continues to be a very demanding question in the Roman Catholic Church. Whereas you might say, well, in this particular couple, perhaps it's better for them to get a divorce than to not get a divorce. By better, we usually mean their lives would be happier. Should the church be making those kinds of decisions about people's lives? These questions, even if we look at something like divorce, where we're not necessarily looking at people who are sexual minority, these questions are tremendously difficult for a church. And in fact, they're tremendously difficult for everyone. So I think instead of making blanket decisions about what are minority cases, in most cases, and in fact, the largest cases, single-digit minorities, we might better have a good conversation about what do we do with ideals and how do we live with our failure, and this is almost a universal human failure, to live with ideals and embody an ideal in terms of a community. So I would rather have that conversation than talk about what 3 or 2 or 0.5 or 0.05% of a population wants or desires or can't attain or maybe wishes to attain, and then try to figure out how to remap the world on the basis of those cases.
Should the church have any coercive power or just the suggestive power that they have currently?
Well, everyone has a degree of power. What we usually, when we talk about power, what we usually focus on is state power. I personally don't find it troubling that we are not using state power to, well, for example, I think it would be a problem to use state power to enforce adultery laws. For a long time in the West, it was very difficult to get a divorce, and courts would listen to that. The West has sort of gone to easy divorce, and there have been some ramifications for that too. Usually within 6 years of some degree of marital unhappiness, if the couple decides to stay together, they usually can find happiness again. So I think in most cases, state power should be used as a last resort. And people, generally speaking, do better when they voluntarily pursue an outcome rather than they are coerced by the state using its power to take away your freedom or even take away your life. So in that sense, I would want the state to afford a large degree of freedom. But I think it's also important that groups of people have the kind of freedom to voluntarily create communities and to exercise a degree of discipline within those communities. So, again, we tend to want to jump to broad cases and extreme ideas, whereas most people in America would say, we don't really want the government policing adultery. Yet adultery is one of those, or cheating is one of those few sexual norms that is nearly universally continues to be embraced. So it's, if you understand sort of the interplay between those two things, we might be able to find some ways forward with some of the other situations with some, again, single digit minorities.
How do you work with and interpret the Bible?
Well, I work with the Bible every week. Part of my vocation as a minister is to interpret the Bible for people. I was generally trained in what's known as the grammatical historical interpretation of the Bible that tends to emphasize the grammar in the text and the historical context to the degree that we know it behind the Bible. At the same time, over the last 30, 40 years, a lot of, I think, useful interpretation has come through through recognizing that historically the communities had literary devices, and these kinds of tools sort of help us, I think, better understand perhaps what original intended audiences understood by the text within their frame of meaning and interpretation. So I usually try to get some understanding of perhaps how the passage would have been heard to its original hearers, and then try to bring it to contemporary hearers in a way that perhaps can speak to their context as well. And I think that's, in some ways, the job of a preacher, to sort of connect these two worlds. And so that's, part of my craft and what I do every week.
If you could no longer be a minister, what do you think you would do?
I don't know. I'm getting old enough that if I could no longer be a minister, I'd probably like to retire and maybe keep making YouTube videos. I've found that I've enjoyed this. Well, not just enjoying making YouTube videos, but meeting people through this YouTube channel, having conversations with them, and really talking about some of the big, meaningful questions in life. Could I make a career of that? Well, I've now had, almost 30 years in this career. So at some point I'll retire and maybe I'll just keep doing this kind of thing.
What are your thoughts about non-theism, and do they believe in God?
Well, so John Vervaeke is a regular conversation partner of mine, and John identifies as a non-theist, and I think well, especially in the case of John Vervaeke, non-theists often identify that way because they understand some of what is built into the atheist concept. Now, I hear some atheists say things like, well, the only thing about atheists is that they don't believe in God. And I think many non-theists understand that even that atheist framework assumes too much. And so someone like John Vervaeke is a non-theist physicalist. And so he believes sort of creation from the bottom up. And I still find a lot of difficulty getting there myself. But again, non-theists tend to, I think, be a little bit more aware of some of what goes into that label atheism.
In that case, what are your objections to physicalism?
Physicalism can't account for itself in that people want to talk about the laws of physics, but the laws of physics themselves are not physical. So where do the laws come from? I once heard Daniel Dennett on the radio show Unbelievable, and he said there's matter and information. Well, the thing is, once you have information, you basically have smuggled in so much of so much. Why are things formed in the way that they're formed? You can't, again, the laws of physics are not physical. What are they? Where are they located? How are they instantiated? It's Jordan Peterson has this fun little quip, which isn't original to him. In some ways, a physicalist would say, give me one miracle and I'll explain the rest. Well, okay, but if your main point is there are no miracles, where do you start from? And so I don't find the position compelling at all.
Is Jordan Peterson a Christian?
Considering he typically rejects a physical notion of the resurrections.
He doesn't well, Jordan is reliably complex on questions like this. Sometimes he identifies as a Christian, sometimes he does not. He hasn't necessarily denied the resurrection. He usually says he doesn't know. And when Sam Harris was sort of pushing him on this, he said almost certainly not, which is what Sam Harris wanted him to say. But so I don't think it's whether Jordan Peterson identifies as a Christian isn't actually as important as whether God identifies him as such. So I don't have a problem with Jordan leaving things ambiguous, partly because it seems that Jordan practices the more modernist take that someone's personal views should be allowed to be kept private. So fair enough. But I found Jordan Peterson to be a very interesting individual, a fun thinker, and a fun guy to listen to. And what I thought was amazing was that in the wake of Jordan Peterson's work, a good many people who had no interest in Christianity or the Bible suddenly found interest in Christianity and the Bible. So what that's about, that's a good deal of what I've been trying to figure out.
Can society stand without religion?
I don't think people live without religion. They might not call it religion, but if you understand, sometimes in my videos, I distinguish between what I call religion S and religion W. Religion S is sort of a secular perspective on religion that believes that religion is a discrete area of life that includes concepts like the supernatural or divine revelation. And that's never really been my definition of religion. There are many religions that don't have what we would imagine to be a god or miracles or things like that. Religions are what I call religion W, which is more of a worldview. They're basic answers to what are we? Where do we come from? What are we for? Where are we going? These are basic questions that almost anyone has to live out of if they want to have a sense of meaning. So, with that definition, everybody has a religion. They might not call it a religion, but it acts like a religion in their lives. And this is actually something that I learned in junior high school in my Bible class, and I haven't found it to be untrue.
Do you have any closing thoughts?
No, this was fun. This was yeah, no, this is fine. I hope it meets what you're looking for.
Thank you for coming on. You can find his links in the description below. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.